It's time now for the press review with Solange Mougin. Good to see you, Solange. You're clearly going to start out with that story out of Washington. Scenes of American carnage really unfolding on the steps of the Capitol.
Yeah, and there was a lot of shock and outrage coming across the board from the American press. But let's start with the Washington Post. Trump mob storms Capitol. That is their headline today, directly blaming the president for, quote, inciting crowds to acts of insurrection and violence, end quote. Now, beyond the strong language that's used there, what's interesting as well is the articles that they've chosen for below the fold. There's one from Black Lives Matter protesters who feel that Capitol Police, Capitol Security not only was unprepared.
Where were they?
Exactly, and there are actually other articles saying that they knew about this. It was online already. But anyway, the Washington Post says that compared to the Black Lives Matter protests, they were quote unquote gentle to the white rioters. That the arrests don't match the crowd numbers or the damage done. There's also an editorial about Mike Pence and Mitch McConnell having finally defied the president after years of subservience, and another entitled "The Day American Democracy Was Brought to the Brink," in which the editorial speaks of American carnage and extraordinary anarchy.
And there's one article in particular from the Post that's getting a lot of traction.
Yeah, you could also almost sort of call it the big whammy from the Post because it comes from their editorial board. It really is the voice of the paper, and it argues that Trump should be removed immediately. It says, quote, every second Trump retains the vast powers of the presidency is a threat to public order and national security, end quote. And the paper says the 25th Amendment should be invoked immediately. Now, Article 24 of the 25th Amendment allows for a president to be stripped of his powers if he is unable to govern. Now, for that to happen, Mike Pence would need to convince a majority of the cabinet to do so. We're not there yet. It may not ever happen. But Axios says the idea is or was gaining traction at least before the spokesperson of Donald Trump said that there will be an orderly passation of power. We'll see if this idea continues to gain traction.
I mean, Donald Trump clearly making sure he's being etched in U.S. history books for years to come. So pretty strong condemnations coming from the Washington Post. How are other editorials dealing with the story?
Well, the LA Times has an excellent opinion piece saying, quote, Trump spoke of American carnage and he's made it his reality. That it is a product of the president's delusion, egoism, and deliberate provocation, that shocking as it was, the chaos, rather the insurrection, shouldn't have been surprising, end quote. Now, put in simpler terms, what has happened in the Capitol was a coup. That's according, or an attempted one, that's according to The Atlantic. The Atlantic directly states, as do many papers, that this was Trump's fault, that the blame, though, doesn't stop there. The Atlantic says that, quote, some of Trump's allies share the blame. Now, this sentiment is also shared by the New York Times and their editorial board, which, quote, says this isn't just an attack on the election, it sets a precedent, a permission slip for similar opposition of future elections, end quote. Now, the Times says that Republican leaders are as well starting to fear the consequences of enabling Trump. That, quote, those who sow the wind reap the whirlwind, end quote, pointing the finger at Mitch McConnell, at Republicans who have supported Trump for the past 4 years, and some of whom are still supporting him.
Ted Cruz, one example. Now, what about the conservative American press? Are they any more forgiving to what happened yesterday?
Not anymore, at least. Or at least the enabling that we may have seen beforehand is pretty much gone. Let's start with the New York Post. Capitol invasion is how the conservative tabloid covers the story, describing how police had drawn their guns and we now know had to shoot at some of them, the mob of Trump's supporters. Now, for the Daily News, this was a siege of the president's making. It was a day that will live in infamy, a day that will go down in the history books as a dark one for American democracy. And it was, for the conservative Wall Street Journal, and not a tabloid here, but a major paper, a disgrace on Capitol Hill, one fueled by lies about a stolen election. It praises in the article Mitch McConnell and Mike Pence for starting the proceedings with calls not to contest the election, and it calls for Republicans to back Joe Biden's election and transition of power.
And finally, Solange, you found some cartoons to end with.
Yes, a little bit of fun here. Let's start with Matt Davies of the Newsday. He has Trump opening up the sewers of the Great Dome of the Capitol, a Make American Great Again ideology that is basically a flood of excrement on democracy. We also have Chapat. He's been inspired by Rudy Giuliani today, Trump's own enabler-in-chief, you could call him, carrying a rigged election file, and you have Trump responding with his fists clenched, saying, "Rudy, can you drive a tank?" Reaction there that was actually quite serious, possibly at the time of the etching of this cartoon, as people feared Trump would continue with the violence. Now, finally, a cartoon by Glenn Lelièvre entitled Free Bird, where you have a bird from Twitter tied up in the Oval Office, and the police charging to free Tweety, and him saying, "Thank God," now referring here to the unprecedented action by Twitter and Facebook to suspend or lock the president's accounts so that he stops spewing lies.
Better late than never. Solange, thank you very much for that. Solange Moujan there with the press review. You can check out other editions of the press review on our website. The address is france24.com. That's it for this edition of Live from Paris. From all of us on the team, thank you very much for watching.